The crowd screams as the blade falls and a queen's head hits the basket. Blood splatters against the wood, Paris roars with triumph, and the woman once called Your Majesty becomes nothing more than a corpse on display. How does the most powerful woman in France end her life as entertainment for the mob? Just years before, she danced in golden halls, drowned in jewels, and feasted on delicacies, while her people starved. Would you believe that the guillotine was built not just to kill her but to erase her? Stay with me, because her fall is more horrifying than her death. She sparkled in diamonds while the people clawed at scraps of bread. In the eyes of Paris, Marie Antoinette was not just a queen, she was a thief, a foreign parasite sucking the lifeblood from France. The cruel irony. She never ruled the kingdom directly, yet she became the face of everything the people hated. At just 14, she arrived from Austria, a teenage bride sent to seal a political alliance. Versailles welcomed her with golden gates and whispered suspicion. She was foreign, young, and an outsider in a court that never forgave mistakes. The hidden cost of her beauty and charm was that every jealous eye became a watchful enemy. But Versailles was designed to blind. Endless halls of marble, ceilings painted with gods, chandeliers dripping with light, it was a theater of excess, and Marie Antoinette played her part perfectly. She hosted balls where gowns glittered like fire, gambled through the night while servants poured rivers of wine, and wore hairstyles so massive they defied gravity. And here was the first fracture. Every pearl she flaunted outside those palace walls became another reason for the people to starve her in effigy. Seeking freedom from the suffocating formality of court, she built the Petit Trianon, her private retreat, away from prying eyes. There she dressed as a shepherdess, milking perfumed cows and playing at rural simplicity. But the irony was sharp while peasants fought for crumbs. Their queen played poverty as though it were a costume. To the people, it was not charming. It was mockery. Whispers grew into shouts. Pamphlets painted her as Madame Deficit, draining France's treasury on gowns and jewels. They accused her of corruption, of adultery, of sins too vile to name. The truth no one wanted to admit. She gave to charity, she adored her children, and she wept for the nation's suffering. But perception was more powerful than reality, and the people saw only a monster. Then came the phrase that sealed her fate, "Let them eat cake." She never spoke those words. They were a lie whispered into the mob's ear. But the mob believed, and belief was far more dangerous than truth. With every rumor, every scandal, every exaggeration, Marie Antoinette's name became less human, more symbol. She was no longer a queen, she was hunger itself, wearing a crown. Louis XVI, her husband, made everything worse. Hesitant, weak, and indecisive, he failed to govern as the country collapsed under debt and famine. And so, the people looked past him to her. In their eyes, the Austrian queen pulled the strings, whispered poison into the king's ear, and laughed while children starved. This was the beginning of her doom. Not her words, not her deeds, but the illusion that she was to blame. Bread riots exploded in Paris. Tax collectors were beaten in the streets. Farmers abandoned their fields under crushing debt. And still, at Versailles, the music played. The chandeliers sparkled, the queen danced, and the illusion of safety lingered. But illusions can't hold back fire. The hunger of the people would soon become a fury too great for palace walls. The pamphlets became darker. They accused her of treason, of debauchery, even of crimes against her own son. Most were lies, grotesque fabrications, but the mob devoured them. Here was the cruelest twist. Her reputation was destroyed not by what she did, but by what people wanted to believe. Versailles turned from paradise to prison. Every gown she wore became a weapon against her. Every laugh echoed like an insult in the ears of her starving subjects. She tried to smile, to soften her image, but it was too late. The people didn't want a queen to love, they wanted a villain to hate. And so the woman who once seemed untouchable found herself drowning in suspicion, lies, and rage. Her silks and jewels no longer shielded her, they condemned her, because when a mob is hungry, luxury becomes a death sentence. The queen of excess was now the queen of blame. And while she smiled through candlelight and music, the storm outside Versailles grew louder, closer, unstoppable. The nightmare was just beginning, and the pounding of fists on her palace gates would prove it. The palace walls shook not from music, but from fists. In October 1789, Versailles, once a temple of luxury, became a battlefield. Paris was starving, bread had vanished, and rumors swirled that the queen herself hoarded grain. The cruel truth? All it took was hunger to turn a crowd into an army. Thousands of women, furious and desperate, marched from Paris to Versailles. They carried knives, clubs, muskets, anything sharp enough to pierce flesh. They wanted bread, they wanted justice, and above all, they wanted the queen. What began as a protest became a siege. As the mob gathered outside, their voices thundered against the golden gates. Bread, bread, bread. Inside, the queen paced, her children clutched to her chest, while Louis hesitated. Here was the fatal flaw. The king delayed, the queen was hated, and the mob would not wait. By nightfall, the rioters stormed the gates. Guards were cut down, blood spilled across the marble floors, and torches lit the gardens like a funeral pyre. Can you picture it? The palace of mirrors and chandeliers shaking under the boots of the poor? Versailles was no longer a fortress. It was prey. The mob burst into the queen's chambers, slashing her bed to ribbons, hunting her like an animal. She escaped only moments before, fleeing barefoot through hidden corridors. The chilling twist? The Queen of France, draped in silk hours before, now ran for her life in the shadows of her own palace. By dawn, the crowd demanded her appearance. Guards forced her to step onto a balcony, her children dragged away, her body trembling as she faced thousands of eyes. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then she bowed her head. To the mob, it was surrender. To her, it was humiliation. The irony was cruel. The same balcony where she once waved to admirers now became her trial stage. Louis, powerless, agreed to the mob's demand. The king and queen would leave Versailles forever. Their golden cage was finished. Paris would be their prison. And it gets worse. The same people who once cheered their coronation now forced them into the capital like captives, carts rolling through streets where every jeer was a knife. The march back to Paris was grotesque theater. Ahead of the procession, rioters carried the heads of slain guards on pikes, their faces smeared with blood, their eyes staring lifelessly at the queen. What darker omen could there be? The people weren't begging anymore, they were warning her of her fate. From that day, Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen in a palace. She was a prisoner of the people. Versailles, the symbol of divine rule, was emptied. The revolution had won its first great victory, and the royal family was caged in the heart of a city that hated them. Here's the grim reality. The march on Versailles wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the nightmare. The queen's fall had only just begun, and every step from that balcony led closer to the guillotine. Once a queen, now a prisoner. Once admired, now despised. And here's the brutal truth. By the time Marie Antoinette entered Paris, she was already guilty in the eyes of her people. The march from Versailles had stripped her of majesty. Crowds no longer bowed, they spat. In pamphlets sold on every corner, she was no longer Her Majesty, but l'Autrichienne, the Austrian witch. The cruel twist? She was hated not only for being queen, but for being foreign, a symbol of betrayal before she even spoke. Propaganda tore her apart. Pamphlets accused her of draining the treasury, mocking the poor, and feasting while children starved. Others whispered of lovers, orgies, and plots to poison the people. It didn't matter if any of it was true, truth had already lost the battle. What mattered was that the mob believed it. The most grotesque accusations came later. That she corrupted her own son. That she was guilty of crimes too vile to repeat. And the darkest irony? She could say nothing in her defense. Every word she spoke was twisted into proof of her guilt. Silence condemned her. Speech condemned her. There was no escape. Meanwhile, the bread riots grew worse. France was drowning in hunger and debt. To the mob, Marie Antoinette wasn't just a queen, she was the reason their children starved. What happens when suffering needs a face? The crowd gives it one. Her jewels, her gowns, her foreign accent became the perfect mask for every wound France carried. The press devoured her. Pamphlets portrayed her as a monster, a harlot, a vampire sucking the life from the nation. The more grotesque the story, the more eagerly it spread. Here's the cruel secret. Revolutions don't need truth. They need an enemy. And the Queen was the perfect villain. Her children were dragged into the fire too. The Dauphin, her young son, was mocked as a bastard. Her daughter cursed for sins she never committed. The family's private grief became public entertainment. Can you imagine watching your children suffer, knowing the mob cheered every tear? For Marie Antoinette, motherhood became another weapon turned against her. Even Louis faded into the background. Weak, indecisive, he was seen as pathetic, almost irrelevant. But Marie Antoinette, she was painted as dangerous, manipulative, the true enemy of France. The cruel irony? She had less power than they imagined, yet more blame than any tyrant in history. Her name became a curse. In the taverns, her face was burned in effigy. In the markets, her name was spat like poison. And here's the chilling twist. When a ruler becomes less than human, their death is no longer murder, it's justice in the eyes of the mob. By 1791, escape was impossible. She and her family tried to flee Paris in secret, hoping to reach allies. They were caught, dragged back in chains, paraded through jeering crowds. Any last illusion of majesty was gone. From that moment, the Queen was no longer seen as royalty, only as prey. The sickest part? Her trial had already begun, not in a courtroom, but in the streets, in the pamphlets, in the whispers of the mob. The verdict was decided long before she ever stood before judges. Marie Antoinette was no longer a queen of France. She was the people's enemy. And when the people crown you their enemy, there is only one ending. Versailles had been a golden cage. Paris would be an iron one. After the failed escape in 1791, Marie Antoinette's fate was sealed. She was no longer just watched, she was owned. Here's the bitter truth. The Queen of France became a prisoner of her own people. Her family was confined to the Tuileries Palace, transformed from a royal residence into a fortress of guards. Every movement was shadowed, every whisper overheard. Windows were nailed shut, corridors patrolled. Can you imagine the silence of a palace where laughter was forbidden, where even your children's footsteps echoed like crimes, but the walls kept closing in? When the monarchy was officially abolished, they were dragged from the Tuileries to the Temple, a medieval fortress turned into a dungeon. Once, Marie Antoinette had chosen silks, perfumes, and jewels. Now, she wore plain dresses, her hair unwashed, her face pale in candlelight. The cruel irony? The woman mocked for excess was stripped until she had nothing. Her husband, Louis, was executed in January 1793. His head, lifted high before the crowd, was both warning and prophecy. Here's the chilling twist. The mob wasn't satisfied with the king's blood. They wanted hers. And in her cell, Marie Antoinette knew it. The days in the temple stretched into nightmares. Guards mocked her. Spies reported her every word. Her young son, the Dauphin, was ripped from her arms, turned against her, coached to accuse his own mother of unspeakable crimes. What darker punishment could there be than watching your child stolen, corrupted, and used as a weapon? Even in chains, she tried to hold dignity. She prayed. She wrote letters to her surviving daughter. She clung to the last fragments of her identity. But every kindness was twisted into weakness. Every prayer was mocked. The truth no one dared speak. Her trial was already written, her sentence already signed. By August 1793, she was moved again, this time to the Conciergerie, the grim prison at the heart of Paris. Known as the antechamber of the guillotine, it was the last stop for those marked for death. Its walls dripped with damp, its air stank of rot, and prisoners there did not leave alive. The cruelest irony, the Queen of France, who once lived in palaces of mirrors and gold, now slept on straw in a stone cell, waiting for a blade. The people outside cheered her suffering. They demanded her trial, her death, her humiliation. Inside, Marie Antoinette aged years in months. Her hair turned white, her body wasted, her spirit battered. This was no longer a queen, it was a ghost, kept alive only to be killed in public. And yet, the nightmare wasn't over, because the sickest twist was still to come. The trial itself, a spectacle designed not to find truth, but to destroy her utterly, to erase her dignity before the blade took her life. The guillotine was ready long before the trial began. In October 1793, Marie Antoinette was dragged from her damp cell in the conciergerie and thrust into the revolutionary tribunal. Here's the dark truth. This wasn't justice, it was theater. The courtroom was packed, not with jurors hungry for truth, but with a mob hungry for blood. Every seat creaked under men and women who had already judged her guilty. The judges sneered, the prosecutors smirked, and pamphleteers scribbled notes to twist into scandal by nightfall. How do you defend yourself when the verdict is carved in stone before you speak? The charges read like poison. Treason against France, conspiracy with foreign powers, corruption of the monarchy. But then came the vilest blow, that she had committed incest with her own young son, the Dauphin. The boy, torn from her in the temple, had been coached into parroting lies. And here's the sickest twist. Even her child was weaponized against her. For a moment, the queen who had stood silent through accusations finally broke. Tears streamed down her face, and she looked not to the judges, but to the crowd of mothers in the gallery. Her words cut through the lies. I appeal to all mothers. Could I ever commit such a crime? The silence that followed was heavy. Even some of her enemies lowered their eyes. But sympathy was dangerous, and the trial pressed on. Witnesses were paraded forward, many bribed, many coached, some inventing stories outright. They accused her of bleeding the treasury dry, of plotting with foreign armies, of mocking the starving poor. Every rumor that had ever slithered through Paris was now read aloud as evidence. The cruel irony? Rumor itself became law. Marie Antoinette, once a queen draped in diamonds, stood pale, thin, and broken. She spoke only rarely, her voice soft, her body frail. Yet even in that weakness, she refused to grovel. Her silence, her composure, became her last weapon. The hidden cost, every shred of dignity she showed, only enraged the tribunal further. The trial lasted 2 days, but the outcome was never in doubt. On October 15th, the jury returned after barely an hour of deliberation. Guilty. Guilty of treason. Guilty of crimes she had never committed. Guilty because the revolution demanded it. Would you call this justice or execution dressed in legal robes? The sentence was death. At dawn, she would be taken to the guillotine. She was led back to her cell, where she wrote her final letter to her sister-in-law, a farewell soaked in sorrow, but not fear. She spoke of her children, of forgiveness, of her soul prepared for God. But the nightmare wasn't finished. The true humiliation was yet to come. Because executions in Paris weren't quiet, they were performances, spectacles of revenge. And the Queen's death would not be dignified. It would be paraded, jeered, and celebrated in blood. Here's the chilling reality. The trial didn't condemn her to death, it condemned her to spectacle. And by morning, Paris would gather to watch the blade fall on its queen. October 16th, 1793. The blade gleamed in the morning sun. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, was led from her cell to meet her end. Her hair, once powdered and towering, had turned white in prison. Her dress was plain, her face pale. Here's the cruel truth. The woman once dressed in diamonds now looked like any other prisoner, except for the crowd that waited to devour her death. She was placed in a simple cart, the same used to haul criminals to the scaffold. No carriage, no guards of honor, no royal procession, just a rattling wooden cart pulled through Paris streets. And the sickest twist? The city celebrated. Crowds cheered, vendors sold food. Children clambered onto shoulders to see the show. This was not execution, it was entertainment. As the cart rolled forward, insults and curses rained down. Some spat at her, others screamed, "Death to the Austrian!" Drums pounded in rhythm, drowning out her silence. She sat straight, hands bound, her eyes fixed ahead. Even her composure enraged them. How dare she look regal in chains? At the scaffold, she stepped down carefully, her hands tied, her legs trembling. The executioner reached to strip away her last dignity, cutting her hair to clear the blade's path. The dark irony? The same hair that had once been piled high with jewels was now hacked away like a criminal's. As she climbed the wooden steps, silence spread. Thousands leaned forward to watch every movement. One slip, one stumble, and she would fall not as a queen, but as a broken woman. And then it happened. She accidentally stepped on the executioner's foot. Her last words, whispered, were simple. "Pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it." The final twist. The Queen of France's last act was an apology to the man about to kill her. The drums beat louder. The crowd held its breath. The blade was raised high. Can you hear it? The moment before the fall, when an entire city stares at a single neck. The blade dropped, a single crack of steel, and her head fell into the basket. Blood soaked the wood, steam rising in the autumn air. The executioner held her head aloft, hair dripping red, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Here's the horrifying truth. Thousands of voices roared not in grief, but in triumph, as though murder itself was victory. Some laughed, some wept, but most cheered, waving their hats, their fists, their flags. The queen was gone, erased, turned from royalty to spectacle in a single stroke. And the worst part? Her death didn't bring peace. It only fed the terror, the endless hunger of a revolution that would devour thousands more. Marie Antoinette's body was dumped in an unmarked grave, her name spat like poison across France. The woman who had once ruled from golden thrones ended as dust in a forgotten pit. This was not just an execution. It was erasure. It was revenge dressed as justice, and it was the most horrifying fall a queen had ever endured. The queen was gone, but the guillotine was only just beginning. Marie Antoinette's head fell into the basket. The crowd cheered, and for a fleeting moment, the revolutionaries believed they had won. But the blade didn't stop with the queen. Here's the grim truth. Her death was not the climax. It was the opening act of France's bloodiest chapter. The execution was meant to end an era. The monarchy was destroyed, the queen humiliated, the king already dead. But revolutions are rarely satisfied. Hunger still gnawed at Paris. Bread was still scarce, debts still crushed the nation, and enemies still circled at its borders. And when problems remain unsolved, what does a revolution do? It demands more blood. The reign of terror began like a spark in dry fields, and it spread just as fast. Robespierre and the Jacobins seized control, promising to protect liberty, equality, and fraternity. But their definition of liberty was silence, their equality was fear, and their fraternity was death. The cruel irony? The revolution had promised freedom from tyranny and delivered a new tyranny far worse. Paris became a stage for endless executions. The same Place de la Révolution where Marie Antoinette had died became the theater of death. Every morning, the carts rolled through the streets, loaded with prisoners. Nobles, priests, merchants, peasants, even children. The guillotine was blind. Here's the chilling twist. In the year after the Queen's death, more than 0 people were executed. The tribunals were swift and merciless. Trials lasted minutes. Evidence was irrelevant. Accusations were enough. If someone pointed a finger, you were guilty. If you whispered doubt about the revolution, you were guilty. If you mourned the king or the queen, you were guilty. And the sentence was always the same: death. Would you feel safe in such a world? Or would you count the hours until your own name was called? Even those who cheered the loudest weren't safe. Revolutionary leaders who had demanded the king's head soon found their own rolling into baskets. Georges Danton, once a voice of the revolution, was accused of treason and guillotined. Camille Desmoulins, who had roused the mobs at the revolution's dawn, was executed as a traitor. Hébert, the radical journalist who poisoned the people with pamphlets, met the same fate. The sickest irony? The revolution devoured its own children, one by one. Robespierre himself, the man who claimed to defend virtue with the sword of terror, would eventually follow. But before his fall, he turned France into a nation ruled by paranoia. Citizens informed on neighbors. Families turned against each other. A careless word, a sigh too heavy, even silence could mean death. This was not liberty, it was survival by fear. And outside the blood-stained streets of Paris, France itself bled. War raged on the borders. Peasants in the countryside rose in rebellion, slaughtering revolutionaries who had stolen their faith, their priests, their traditions. Famine stalked the fields. Cities starved. Here's the brutal truth. Killing a queen did not feed the poor. It only made them hungrier. Marie Antoinette's execution had been framed as justice, but justice had no end. It became revenge without boundaries. Her name was spat in marketplaces, cursed in taverns, mocked in songs. Yet in death she gained a strange power. She became not just a woman, but a symbol, the scapegoat for a nation's pain, and then the ghost haunting a revolution that could not stop killing. Would you call that victory or the beginning of madness? Imagine Paris in those months after her death. The air thick with smoke, the square slick with blood, drums pounding to drown the cries of the condemned. Children clapped at the falling of the blade. Merchants sold trinkets carved from guillotine wood. The guillotine itself was worshipped as the altar of freedom. But the hidden cost was monstrous. A society that made death a daily ritual lost sight of life itself. Even the memory of the queen was twisted beyond recognition. Pamphlets painted her as a monster, a harlot, a foreign parasite. The real Marie Antoinette, the mother, the woman, the frightened prisoner, was erased. And here's the sickest twist. In erasing her humanity, the revolution erased its own. The terror spread until it consumed nearly everyone. Farmers, priests, generals, widows, poets, all marched the same path to the scaffold. The same people who had demanded the fall of royalty now trembled each dawn, wondering if their own name was whispered in the night. What darker lesson is there than this? Once the mob tastes blood, it cannot stop until it drinks its own. By the time the blade finally turned on Robespierre, France was drowning in corpses. The revolution that had begun with ideals ended with mass graves. And yet, through all the carnage, one image lingered. The pale queen in her plain white dress, bowing her head on the scaffold. The cruel irony? The revolution killed her to erase her, but in death, she became eternal. For decades, her body lay in an unmarked grave. But her story would not stay buried. Whispers grew into myths. Painters reimagined her as a tragic saint. Writers turned her fall into warning and legend. Here's the haunting truth. The revolution thought it destroyed Marie Antoinette, but it gave her something kings could never give: immortality. And so, the world after the Queen was not a world of freedom, but a world of fear. France had killed its monarchs, only to chain itself to the guillotine. Her death marked not an end, but a beginning. The beginning of a nightmare that swallowed thousands. Because the execution of Marie Antoinette was never just her story. It was the spark of the terror, the proof that once you start killing queens, you never stop until you've killed your own. Her body was dumped in an unmarked grave, her name spat like poison across Paris. But here's the haunting truth. Marie Antoinette never truly died. Her head fell, yes, but her ghost lingered, whispering through history, shaping how the world remembers queens, power, and downfall. For years after her execution, her grave lay forgotten, hidden beneath mud and weeds. No monument, no crown, no marble stone. The woman who once lived in gilded palaces was reduced to bones beneath the dirt. The cruel irony? The revolution tried to erase her, but in erasing her, it immortalized her. Rumors kept her alive. Some whispered she had been innocent, a victim of lies. Others cursed her as a monster who deserved every drop of blood spilled. In taverns, her name was shouted in hatred. In salons, her story was retold in whispers of regret. The sick twist? The revolution killed her to silence her, but her silence spoke louder than any words she ever said. Artists and writers transformed her into legend. Pamphlets once mocked her as a harlot, but in death, painters began to soften her face, portraying her as a tragic heroine, pale and saintly. Musicians wrote elegies. Writers turned her fall into moral lessons. To some, she became a martyr of monarchy, the symbol of a world destroyed. Would you call that justice, or the rewriting of history? Even her enemies could not resist her ghost. Napoleon, decades later, spoke of her as the symbol of royal arrogance and the revolution's necessity. Others, in the 19th century, looked back at her execution as proof that revolutions could devour beauty, art, and dignity as easily as tyranny. The cruel truth: her ghost was reshaped to fit the needs of every generation. Her story haunted Versailles too. Tourists wandered through the empty halls where she once danced, staring at mirrors that reflected nothing but absence. The Petit Trianon, her private retreat, became a site of eerie fascination. Visitors claimed they felt her presence in its gardens, whispers in the air, footsteps on the gravel. Even today, some believe the Queen never left her stage, that her ghost still walks the palace she loved and lost. In popular memory, Marie Antoinette became the embodiment of decadence. The phrase, "let them eat cake, though never hers," was carved onto her legacy. For centuries, her name has been shorthand for arrogance, extravagance, and the blindness of rulers to their people. Here's the cruel irony. The words that doomed her were lies, but lies became more immortal than truth. Yet another story grew alongside it. The tragic queen, misunderstood, destroyed by rumor, and remembered not for cruelty, but for grace in the face of horror. When she bowed her head at the scaffold, when she apologized to her executioner for stepping on his foot, those moments gave her dignity that no pamphlet could erase. And the darkest twist: in death, the revolution gave her back the humanity it had stolen in life. Her ghost lingers not only in France, but across the world. Hollywood films, novels, and plays continue to resurrect her. She is painted as both villain and victim, sinner and saint. Every retelling asks the same question: was she the monster the mob believed, or the scapegoat of a nation's hunger? Perhaps the reason we can't let her go is because she is both. But her ghost carries a warning too. She is the eternal reminder of what happens when rulers live blind to their people's suffering. Her downfall is a mirror held up to every leader who believes power is permanent, every government that ignores its people, every society that mistakes wealth for safety. The haunting truth: every age has its own Marie Antoinette, and every age has its own guillotine. Imagine walking the streets of Paris today. The guillotine is gone, the crowds dispersed, but her memory hangs over the city like smoke. Statues and museums remember the revolution, but her pale figure still rises from the blood-soaked pages of history. Would you call her guilty, or would you call her a ghost, still demanding her story be heard? In the end, Marie Antoinette became more than a queen, more than a woman. She became a myth. To some, she was the final symbol of aristocratic arrogance. To others, the innocent victim of lies and rage. But to all, she was unforgettable. And that is the cruelest irony of all. The revolution tried to erase her, but it gave her the immortality of legend. The blade fell in 1793. The cheers faded, the grave closed, but her story refused to stay buried. She is still with us in our books, our films, our cautionary tales, our imagination. The ghost of Marie Antoinette walks not just through Versailles, but through history itself. And maybe the most chilling question is this: if her ghost warns us of the cost of power and excess, are we listening, or are we, like her, dancing at the edge of the blade?